We've known about Perthes disease for over 100 years now, and treatment's changed quite a bit in that time. Let's explain. Hello, I'm Gavin, children's orthopedic surgeon, originally from London, now working at Burjeel Hospital for Advanced Surgery in Dubai. Welcome to this video, which is part of the Children's Orthopedic series. I'm here every week discussing conditions that people find confusing or are just looking for more information about. If you have a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to include in this series, then please comment and let us know. We'd love to hear from you. You'll find a link to all of our videos as well as loads more information on all these conditions on our website. There's a link in the description below. So Perthes disease is a relatively uncommon hip condition. It occurs in young children aged between about 4 and 9, occurring more frequently in boys, about 5 times more frequently actually. And it was first described in detail in 1910. So had I been practicing paediatric orthopedics in 1910, then my caseload would have been dominated by one condition, at least as regards children's hip conditions, and that's tuberculosis, an infectious disease with a destructive and relentless course for which I could offer no cure and precious little in terms of restorative treatment. So the big advance with the description of Perthes disease was the identification of a condition which in some ways mimicked tuberculosis in the early stages, but from which children went on to make a full recovery most of the time. So had I been practicing in 1910, the other thing I would have been very interested in would have been the relatively new medical imaging technology of X-ray. So X-rays have been really helpful in terms of determining what's going on in Perthes disease. So it's not an infection like tuberculosis. The problem seems to be a problem with the blood supply to part of the hip joint, specifically the ball of the ball and socket joint, which, for reasons that are not fully understood, it loses the blood supply and then the bone becomes soft and starts to slowly collapse. And then the blood supply is slowly re-established, a healing process takes place, and the whole disease burns itself out after about 3 to 5 years, something like that. So children would have presented in 1910 with Perthes disease much as they present today, with pain in the hip or the groin, in the thigh, confusingly, sometimes in the knee. And that's a common theme actually running through a lot of children's hip conditions. More common than pain actually was limping. So this limp tends to be activity related. Worse at the end of the day, worse after sports, though funnily enough it doesn't actually seem to stop the kids getting up to much. In terms of treatment, in the early part of the 20th century, the rationale went something like this. If the hip was becoming soft, then children should be prevented from taking weight on their hips. So all sorts of clever contraptions were developed to strap these children into to allow them to get around the world for a few years without taking any weight on their hips. So well-intentioned treatment, but very restrictive. But actually, those kids were probably amongst the lucky ones. There are reports of some children with Perthes disease being prescribed bed rest for a number of years, with consequences we can only really guess at. Anyway, 100 years later, we recognise that there are 3 important groups of children with Perthes disease. The first are children who are going to have a good result from this condition, with or without treatment, and that's probably the majority, certainly of younger children. There's a small number of children who tend to have a poor result in terms of the function of their hip, even with treatment. Unfortunately, they're a rare minority. And then there's a third group of patients who we think are heading for trouble with this condition, but who we think we can steer towards a better outcome by instituting treatment. So obviously they're an important group to know about. And there are a number of criteria we use to identify them. It relates to their age, the extent of their disease, how much movement they've lost in their hip, and certain signs on the X-ray. So if we institute treatment for those children, there are basically 2 things we're trying to achieve. The first is that we're trying to achieve a situation where the ball is sitting deeply within the socket and covered by it or contained by it. So that usually requires an operation of some kind. There are basically 2 options which do the same job. The second arm of the treatment is, once that ball is in the socket, to make sure that it keeps moving. So that requires a physiotherapy program of some type. So the 2 arms of the treatment are really important. And the rationale goes like this. In Perthes disease, the socket of the ball and socket joint is actually relatively spared. So what we're trying to do is to use it as a mould, so that as the disease runs its course, by the time it's finished, we have a ball and a socket that fit closely together, because we know the degree of fit is important in terms of the long-term outcome. So one final point on Perthes disease relates to the symptoms, the pain and the limping, because after all, that's what parents see and that's what concerns them. And they're often worried if their child has symptoms like that, that they're heading for trouble. But actually, that doesn't appear to be the case. The frequency and the severity of the symptoms seem to have no real bearing on the ultimate outcome, so I think it's important to offer some reassurance on that side. They certainly do need to be managed, but they don't really seem to be a sign that we're necessarily heading for trouble, even if those symptoms are present. So that's all on Perthes disease, and that's all for this week. If you have any questions arising from topics raised in this video, then please put them in the comments and I'll respond as soon as I can. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button, share it with anybody else you think might be interested, and subscribe to our channel. And I'll be back next week with another video in the Children's Orthopedic series, taking kids stuff seriously.